So this morning we'll be in Job 8 through 14. This is still the first. There's 3 rounds of speeches in Job 3 through 27. This is still the first round of speeches. Now we're going to look in Job chapter 8 at a guy named Bildad who comes to Job. Remember, Job has lost everything. He didn't just lose his job. He lost his family. He lost his possessions. He lost everything. And remember, after he lost everything, finally his wife comes to him and says, Job, just curse God and die. It's over. You've lost everything. So it's so important to remember that because we think about Job and we think about, oh man, I've lost this, or I've lost a job, or I've lost this. No, Job lost everything, which is hard for us to imagine. He's gone through so much suffering, and here his friends come to him thinking they're helping, but really they're hurting. So in Job 8, this guy named Bildad, a friend, speaks up. And Bildad he's the second friend that's going to speak. He's not as courteous as the guy we saw a few weeks ago, Eliphaz. If you look in chapter 8, he essentially, if we were to translate it in English today, he essentially opens by calling Job a windbag. I've never really called someone that, but I guess that's something from a prior generation, because he says you're using wild and whirling words, like your words are full of hot air. You're not speaking truth, Job. So this guy is starting to correct Job. He's not as nice and friendly opening his comments to Job as the previous speaker. And Bildad appears to be, as you read him in chapter 8, a very simple but organized thinker. For Bildad, everything can be explained by looking at 2 types of people in the world. Look at verse 20. There's the blameless. Those are like the good people, and things should be great for them, right? Those are your good people. Those are your Presbyterians, your Lutherans, your Anglicans. Those are the good people. And then he says in verse 13, there's the wicked. Those are the other people, the people who are struggling with sin and not following the Lord. And Bildad just says it's that easy. Like the good people succeed and the bad people fail. That's a very simplistic way to look at life, obviously. So in verse 3, Bildad says, does God pervert justice? But Job has already asserted this. He's already commented on that with the previous speaker because Job clearly believes that God is just. So that's why he doesn't know what's happened, because he hasn't deserved this in his opinion. Bildad then goes a step further and reasons that perhaps it was Job's children who sinned. Well, Job, maybe your children did this and now you're receiving the justice from God. I'm not sure if that's true or not. It's actually not. Verses 8 through 10, Bildad confidently goes on to claim that he is merely speaking ancient wisdom. I'm just giving you wisdom to live by, Job. This is what you need to hear and live by. And this appears to be one of the themes of Job, to question received understanding, received tradition about suffering and tribulation. Because, again, it's worth just highlighting. Every person, whether they're a Christian or not, will go through suffering. They will go through tribulation. They will go through hard times. That is life. And here in the book of Job, one of the themes is to question the ancient wisdom or received tradition of, well, if you just live good enough, things will be fine. You don't have to deal with any of that. Well, that's not really true, actually. And Job is a case study in that. So the author of Job gives us a description of the destruction of the wicked man in verses 11 through 19 of chapter 8. And this complements what Eliphaz had said in chapter 5. The summary of Bildad's speech is found in verses 20 through 22, where he says, the wicked will be put to shame and the righteous received by the Lord. And you can compare that with Psalm 126, verse 2. So Bildad tells Job ancient wisdom, truth, that the righteous are blessed, the wicked are going to perish. That's helpful as a general guide to overall life. If you're looking at life from 30,000 feet, how things work. But when a person is suffering, when a person who is following the Lord, a person who's trying to honor the Lord with their life is suffering, that's not what you tell them. That's not what they need to hear. That's not what they should hear. And that's the lesson here that we're beginning to see. A 4th century theologian from Syria, a guy named Ephraim, said this about Bildad. He says, quote, Bildad reproached Job because he thought that the words that Job had said for the sake of truth and justice were spoken out of arrogance and disdain. So Bildad is trying to correct Job for being arrogant, not receiving traditional truths about life. And that's just, as a practical note, that's just not a helpful way to counsel and help people who are going through something, to say, well, the wicked perish and the righteous are going to be okay. That generally doesn't work, because that is a truth for all of life, in the sense of at the end of your life, when you stand before God, if you've given your life to the Lord, you belong to Him. And if you haven't, then you do not belong to Him. So that is true. But when a Christian who is following the Lord loses their job, goes through a traumatic experience, that's not the wisdom to share with them. We'll come back to that in a little bit. How does Job reply? Job replies in chapter 9 through 10. And he begins with the same question that Job had asked Eliphaz in chapter 4. How can I be right with God? How can I be right before Him? How can I contend with a righteous God? And again, this is contend. This is courtroom language. This is like forensic language of how can I approach a judge who is righteous when I'm not righteous. So it's forensic language. And then Job's response is a poem similar to Psalm 147, where Job reveals that he believes in the power and the justice of God, but he cannot make sense of what God is doing in light of his current experience. I think that probably resonates with every single person here. I know God is powerful and just and good, but how does that resonate with what is happening today or yesterday or last year? So Job rejects Bildad's assertion from chapter 8, verse 5, that he should appeal for mercy. And he essentially says in verse 15 of chapter 9, a good translation would say, I will not appeal for mercy to my accuser. And he reaffirms that in verse 20. So in Job chapter 9, Job believes he's in the right, but he doesn't know how to make sense of his experience. He also doesn't know what to do about it. I've lost everything. What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to rebuild my business? Am I supposed to start a new family? Am I supposed to increase my church involvement and my tithing? And we got to do this and we got to do that. I've got to go. What am I supposed to do? And that's a good question that we wrestle with when things go wrong. Lord, what am I supposed to do? So Job is not claiming innocence arrogantly. He's saying, I just don't know I'm confused. I'm not sure what's happening. His statement in chapter 9, verse 22, is kind of the other side of the coin of Christ's teaching that God sends rain on the just and the unjust. It's kind of the other side of the coin. Like, well, I'm a good person. I'm trying to be. I'm honoring the Lord. And my whole life has fallen apart, to put it mildly. Then in chapter 9, verses 25 through 31, Job reflects on the brevity of life. And he uses three images. The sprinter, and then he uses the skiffs of an Egyptian boat, the reeds on an Egyptian speedboat, and then he uses the image of an eagle swooping down on its prey to convey the image that your life is short, Your life is a vapor, the Bible says. It's here one day and it's gone the next. In the final verses of chapter 9, Job returns to the primary problem, the problem of suffering. And Job calls for an umpire. He calls for a mediator. In verse 33, who will settle the problem and negotiate to bring him and God together. And so in chapter 9, verse 34, Job recognizes that it's up to God to remove the rod of his discipline, his punishment, whatever it might be, he doesn't know from him. And then in chapter 10, Job returns. You see his audience changes. He turns to speaking directly to God about his suffering. Because Job, to use the language of Isaiah 53, Job has become a man of sorrow, a man who is suffering. And he's sorrow. He's not the cheerleader out front who's just so happy about his Christian experience and he cranks up the Christian music radio and he feels great. That's not Job. He's a man of sorrows who suffered. And you think about Old Testament names that you recognize, that you think about. Most of them did suffer. Think about Jacob. Think about Joseph. Joseph's a great example. Moses as well. Think about Ruth, Hannah. You could do a whole sermon this morning on the suffering of Jeremiah, a prophet who was rejected most of his ministry. And then as tradition tells us, not the Bible, he was killed in Egypt, not even in his own home country. So suffering is part of the Old Testament, and Job is one aspect of trying to understand and make sense of the problems, the pain of life. One scholar makes it a good point about Job's words in chapter 10. He says this, quote, in chapter 10, "It is a remarkable fact, but very revealing of Job's mind, that in none of his petitions to God does he make the obvious request for his sickness to be cured." as if everything will be all right when he is well again. That is remarkable. If you look at Job's petitions in chapter 10, he doesn't make the obvious request for his sickness to be cured. That for me, that is a convicting reminder, because if things are going wrong, Lord, just solve the problem and I'm okay. Which means I'm not so concerned about my relationship with God. I just want this problem removed. And for Job, we know his health problems, for example, there's a litany of things he's wrestling with and struggling with. But Job does not appeal for God to heal him, to put his hand on him and heal him. Interesting thought. Verse 8 through 13 of chapter 10 reveal that Job is still confident that God's primary intentions with making humanity are good. So Job's question is, I know God is good. Again, why has he left me in this situation of suffering? And he alludes to Genesis 2 here in verse 9 of chapter 10. Then in verses 14 through 17, Job transitions. You can sense the tone in chapter 10. In verse 14 through 17, he transitions to being agitated and upset again. So again, you see his tone. This is not a machine going through, a man with no emotion and feeling going through an experience. He has highs and lows. He has good days and bad days, good experiences, bad experiences as he's struggling through this. His hope in verses 14 through 17, his hope in God appears to be exhausted because he has no answer. And he concludes his response to Bildad by, again, verse 18, wishing he had never been born. It's very positive, Job. Or that he had died in the womb, 18b, or that he had never been conceived. And that's the second time I think that he's done that, verse 19a. So this is a man struggling. This is a man who is wrestling with the purpose of his life, the meaning of his life, the existence of his life, because God has providentially allowed for everything to be removed from him. But death does not seem to give him rest from his troubles. That seems to be his allusion there at the end. He uses 4 different terms at the end of chapter 10. Darkness, deep shadow, gloom, thick darkness, to describe the darkness of the place of the dead, Sheol, as the Old Testament calls it. So he uses these words, and he says, even death will not give me rest. So then the next friend shows up, Zophar, chapter 11. We'll run through Zophar real quick. He finally gets his chance to speak. And this man, I mean, you probably know someone like this. He brings tough love. He doesn't have the gift of like hearing and sympathizing with, having a bad experience or suffering. He brings tough love. So Zophar coldly disapproves in chapter 11 of Job's words and appears to not understand where Job is coming from. Job's words to him are babble and mockery, verse 3 of chapter 11. He accuses Job in verse 2 of being verbose, verses 4 through 6 of being self-righteous, verses 7 through 12 of being too opinionated, and then in verses 13 through 20 of being intractable or stubborn. So just to personalize it, if you're going through pain, you would not call Zophar and ask him to come over. You'd say, Zophar, I changed my phone number. Don't call me. Don't text me. Don't email me. Because he has no sympathy. He's just bringing tough love. And he levels the accusation in verse 4 that were only hinted at earlier, which is he challenges Job's claim, to be innocent and in the right. He actually challenges that. So it's not enough that Job is suffering. Zophar says, I think you're lying too. I mean, this guy is a horrific friend. It's hard to call him a friend at this point. In verses 5 and 6, Zophar and Job share the same wish, that God would speak and settle the issue. However, here's the distinction. Job wants that. He doesn't know what God's going to say. What will God say? Zophar arrogantly claims to know. Here's what God's going to tell you, Job. I know. So you see arrogance, you see condescension, you see an inability to just sympathize with what's going on here. In 7 through 12, the poem here from Zophar is an exposition of the statement he made in verse 6. Zophar goes way too far, though. He claims that men, and he's implying Job here in verse 6, are worthless. And he essentially, let me slow down here, make sure I say this correctly, not say the wrong word. He says, Job, you're stupid like a donkey. That's what he says in verse 6. So he's calling them names. We have different names that we use that are similar to that today. So you get the tone. You get the tone. It is direct. It's hostile. You're dumb as a donkey. So chapter 11 is a lecture to Job. He's lecturing Job. And then in 13 through 20, he's preaching to Job. If only Job would ask for forgiveness, then he would experience a wonderful life. That's what verses 16 through 19 tell us. And then at the end, on top of all of this, here's the conclusion that Zophar gives. Verse 20, he assigns Job to the place of the wicked. So what you see here in chapters 4 through 11 so far in these speeches, these interactions, is it just escalates. And the guilt, the shame, the opposition grows from his three friends. It starts off mild against Job, and now here, he in verse 20 of chapter 11, he consigns Job to the wicked. A 3rd century theologian from Alexandria, a guy by the name of Didymus the Blind, says this about Zophar. Quote, it's from the 3rd century. Although he answered Job, Zophar claimed that there was no one to answer him, Zophar. Thereby, Zophar shows one should not speak so audaciously. Yet he does so himself in maintaining that Job is suffering due to his personal wickedness. Job is suffering due to his personal wickedness. Zophar is claiming that there's no one to answer him. Zophar has all the answers to life, and he's giving them to Job. We'll run quickly through chapter 12 through 14. I'm going to try to go quickly, and then we'll stop and we can talk and discuss this. This is Job's response. They see Job as prideful, hypocritical. However, Job refuses to confess any fake sins. This is commendable, really, for Job. He doesn't say, yeah, you know, maybe you are right. Maybe I did screw up a little bit. And just kind of acquiesce to their claims that he's a sinner. He doesn't do that and say, yeah, if that'll help, I'll do it. You know, yeah, maybe I did lie, even though he didn't lie. Maybe I did steal some money, even though he didn't steal money. Maybe I did. He doesn't do that, which is commendable. His response, this is worth noting, his response in these chapters to Zophar is exceeded in length only by his final speech. So here Job is coming full throttle to respond, to defend himself against his friends. And I think you can detect some sarcasm in Job's words. Many scholars have written about Job is using sarcasm to get his point across here with his friends, because really, at this point, it's safe to say Job has no friends. He's lost everything, including friends, at this point. In chapter 12, verse 3, Job claims that he is at least as intelligent as his friends. He's not a donkey. And he uses the plural there, so he's saying, you guys, I'm not as dumb as you think. In verses 4 through 6, Job asserts that robbers are safe and have peace, while the religious man is disgraced. Job's point here in chapter 12 is really simple. It's that all the acts of God, whether it's animals in verses 7 through 10, or men in verses 14 through 25, all the acts of God are in the hands of God. And it is hard to find a moral pattern in the specifics of the actions of humanity and in creatures. And he alludes in verse 14 and 15 to Noah, to the flood. Verses 17 through 25, he lists numerous people of significance. He gives a long list here. He says counselors, so lawyers, judges, kings, priests, mighty, those that are trusted, elders, princes, strong, the chiefs. His point is that all these people are the most powerful people in his culture are small, insignificant figures that live in the hands of God, even the most powerful. And Job considers himself as someone who is living in the hands of God. So it's a statement of humility from Job in his life. In chapter 13, Job claims that he is their intellectual equal, but he doesn't understand how the truths that they have discussed apply to him. And before Job turns his attention back to God, he has some strong words for his friends. Verses 4 through 12 of chapter 13. He says they're essentially incompetent counselors. He calls them worthless physicians. Basically, kind of like the Proverbs say in the Old Testament, show your wisdom by staying silent. Right? Sometimes it's good not to talk. Sometimes it's good to keep your mouth shut. Then Job appears in verses 7, 8, and 10 of chapter 13 to show concern for his friends by stating that they are in danger because they have presumed to plead God's case for God. He says, you're in danger because you think you know what God's doing. And you've done it with deceit. Verse 11 of chapter 13, Job, this is the Old Testament idea and really a New Testament idea too. Job said there's a fear of God that Job has. He knows the power of God, and he says you guys should be afraid of God as well based on what you've said. Job's argument here suggests that he believes in the justice of God still, despite his circumstances, and his friends have acted wrongly, and they need to be worried about God's reaction. And Job's right here. Verse 15 is a statement that you've probably heard before. Chapter 13, verse 15, though he slay me, I will hope in him. I think the RSV has a different translation. It says, behold, he will slay me, I have no hope. That's kind of a one-off, but most of them have something that says something similar to, though the Lord slay me, I will hope in him. The first word here, if or though the Lord slay me, or if the Lord slay me, it's causal. The words at the end of the phrase can have several meanings, but are translated with as hope, or maybe trust or wait on the Lord, and I will have hope. The traditional translation, I think, is worth keeping, that though he slay me, I will have hope. I will hope in him. That it shows that Job still, and it fits with the tone of Job, he still has optimism, a little bit of optimism in the midst of his life being a total wreck. He realizes that death is not the end for him. John Calvin, a guy we've heard of from the Reformation, has a great translation. He says, he translates this verse, if the Lord slay me, will I not still hope in him? He puts it in the form of a question. If the Lord slay me, Calvin says, will I not hope in him? And again, not to praise Calvin too much, Calvin's not writing that from his office in Cambridge, at Harvard University, or at Yale Divinity. He's writing that in the context of someone who has suffered a lot. And it continues to suffer throughout his ministry in Geneva. So he's not writing that just academically. The final verses of chapter 13 express Job's desire to have his relationship with God restored. And he expresses a wish for two things. He wants relief and just reasons, like we all do. He wants relief from the problems of life, like we all do. And he wants reasons for it. God, why did this happen to me? Like we all do. He wants to know, why is this happening? In verse 20 is interesting. It's an allusion to Cain. Remember Cain and Abel? Cain's the first person to commit homicide. It's an allusion to Cain who hid himself from God. And what Job is saying is, I'm not like Cain. I did not hide myself from God. God has hidden himself from me. That's what Job is saying. And those are the words of a suffering man. God's hidden himself. I'm asking for answers, and he's nowhere to be found. And again, Job doesn't pretend to be innocent, but he says, I want to know what's happening. The final chapter of Job's response, 14, then we'll stop here so we can talk for a few minutes. The final chapter of his response in this opening round, Job oscillates between having hope and giving into despair. So you see a real person here. He's not a machine. He's not just programmed to do one thing or the other. He has hope, and then he's giving into despair. It's very similar to reading the Psalms of David. You read David when he's delivered from the enemy, and David's like leading the choir. He's incredible. He's doing all this stuff. His wife gets upset at him for dancing. You remember that from 1 Samuel or 2 Samuel? And then you read another psalm, and David is like, he's on the verge of just giving up. It's all over. God's left me. Very similar to chapter 14. Job is struggling through this. Job continues his thoughts on God's destructive power in his life using several images. Verses 7 through 13, he uses the image of God lopping off trees and drying up lakes. Verses 18 through 22, soil erosion. He erodes the soil of his own creation. But here, look at this. Verses 14 through 17 are the high point of his speech. This is the high point of chapter 14. The verses are sandwiched between Job's pessimism, but we also see in these verses a glimpse of Job's hope. That even if he goes down to the place of death, Sheol, God can call him to life again. And again, in the Old Testament, Sheol is a temporary place. It's widely seen as a temporary place of where the dead go until God's wrath is past, until God makes everything right. And so in verse 15, Job says his hope is founded on the belief that God will long for the work of his hands. And when this happens, Job believes that God will seal up his sins in a bag. Verse 17, God will seal up his sins, everything he's done wrong, and cover his sins. There's a message of the gospel that's coming. God's going to put all his sins together and cover them. It's called atonement. Covering sin is called atonement. That's going to happen at the cross. Job concludes the poem by reflecting on the pessimism of his life. So again, 14 through 17 are the high point of the speech, but it's surrounded by the pessimism of 18 through 22, where Job describes death in verse 20 using a euphemism. And then in 21 through 22, he reflects on the sadness of death, which is experienced all alone, not with anyone else. It is something we experience alone. So let me stop there so we have some time to conversation, questions, discussion.